The story of Adam and Eve, it's one of the most foundational stories, period. But right at its heart, there's this puzzle, this seeming contradiction that has kept people talking for centuries. Well, today, we're going to look at a theological framework that doesn't just solve the puzzle. It suggests the puzzle was the whole point. So let's dive right in. Okay, so the problem starts right there in the Garden of Eden. God gives Adam and Eve two huge commandments. But when you really look at them side by side, they seem to completely contradict each other. I mean, how could they possibly obey both at the same time? It feels like an impossible situation. And here they are. On one hand, God says, go multiply and fill the earth. Simple enough, right? But on the other hand, he says, whatever you do, do not eat the fruit from that one tree. The tree of knowledge. But here's the catch. Eating that fruit is the very thing that would make them mortal and able to have kids in the first place. So obeying one command seems to make it impossible to obey the other. This isn't just a small detail, it's a major roadblock. So yeah, it really looks like an impossible choice. Was this some kind of divine setup, a test they were designed to fail? Or is there a piece of this whole puzzle that we're missing? This framework we're exploring argues that actually, this tension, this impossible choice, isn't a bug in the story. It's the main feature. And here it is. This is the crucial piece of context that changes everything. According to the source material for this whole framework, Adam and Eve were created in an immortal state. They couldn't get sick, they couldn't die. And in that specific condition, the text says, flat out, they would have had no children. So that command to multiply, it was literally impossible for them to fulfill as long as they stayed in the garden and obeyed the other rules. So how do we square this circle? Well, to get there, we have to talk about the huge difference between a transgression and a sin. They sound like they could be synonyms, but in this way of thinking, they are worlds apart. First up, let's talk about transgression. A transgression is when you break a rule, but you do it without really understanding that it's morally right or wrong. Since the whole point of the tree of knowledge was to give them that knowledge, their act of eating the fruit couldn't have been a sin. It was a transgression. There's no real moral guilt there. Sin, on the other hand, is a whole different ballgame. Sin requires knowledge, it requires intent. It's when you knowingly and willfully rebel against a law that you understand is right. You have to get the moral stakes of your choice for it to count as a sin. The source material uses a really simple analogy to make this clear. Adam and Eve were basically like innocent children. A toddler might break a lamp, which is against the rules, but we don't think of them as being morally evil or guilty. They just don't understand the full consequences yet. That's the idea here. So here's the bottom line. The core takeaway. Eating the fruit was an act of innocence, not an act of rebellion. It was a step they had to take, but they did it without a full grasp of what they were doing. And that single distinction, it changes the entire moral landscape of the story. But hold on, the solution goes even deeper. It's not just about what we call their act. It's also about understanding the commandments themselves. This framework says that God didn't just give two commands, he gave two fundamentally different kinds of commands. This table breaks it down perfectly. The command to multiply was what you might call teleological. That's just a fancy word for goal-oriented. It was about the big picture, the ultimate purpose for all of humanity. But the command not to eat the fruit, that was probationary. It was a temporary rule for their specific situation in the garden. Think of it like this. One command was the final destination, and the other was just a rule for the place they were staying at the moment. They were never meant to be on the same level at the same time. And that's the key that unlocks the whole thing. The contradiction just evaporates. Once you get rid of that hidden assumption that all of God's commandments have to be doable at the exact same moment in the exact same condition. This framework argues that that was never the plan. Now, you might be thinking this is a totally modern take, but what's fascinating is that these core ideas, the innocence, the fall being a necessary step, the lack of inherited guilt, they actually have echoes in some really old Jewish and early Christian thinking, long before Augustine. This timeline really puts it in perspective. You can see that way back in Second Temple Judaism, the fall was often seen more as a step toward growing up, not as a crime. Then you have Irenaeus, a church father in the 2nd century, who saw Adam and Eve as innocent children who made a mistake. It was really Augustine, way later in the 5th century, who cemented the idea that became so dominant in the West, that the fall was a crime that created this inherited guilt. So in a way, the framework we're talking about is actually circling back to some of these much earlier interpretations. Okay, so the pieces all seem to fit together pretty neatly. It resolves the contradiction, it offers a coherent moral picture. Which leads to the biggest question of all. If the logic is sound, why isn't this the view everyone has? What's the holdup? I mean, you have to admit, from a purely logical point of view, the theory is really solid. It's internally consistent. It solves the problem it sets out to solve without any weird gymnastics. So what is the real disagreement then? If it isn't about the internal logic, if it's not a philosophical problem, where's the actual debate? And here we have it, the core debate. The real sticking point isn't about logic at all. It's about authority. Whether you accept or reject this whole framework comes down to what you believe about revelation, specifically whether you believe modern scripture can have the authority to clarify ancient scripture. Let's break that down for a second. The book of Genesis, on its own, is pretty ambiguous on these points. It just leaves these questions hanging. All the clarity we've been talking about, this whole transgression, not sin model, it depends completely on information from texts outside of the traditional Bible, like the book of Moses or 2 Nephi. So the argument isn't really about Adam and Eve in the end. It's about which sources of knowledge you consider valid and authoritative to begin with. And that really leaves us with a final, much bigger question to chew on. We've just seen how one system of belief completely reframes a foundational story to solve a huge problem within it. And it forces us to ask ourselves, what happens to our understanding of any foundational story when its oldest interpretations are challenged, not by logic, but by a claim to new authority?